Imagine taking the historic White House, right? Like the
Right.
global symbol of American democracy, a building you can instantly recognize from anywhere in the world,
Hmm.
and aggressively bolting a 90,000 square foot, $400 million Vegas-style ballroom onto the side of it.
Just sticking it right on there.
Exactly. A room that is, I mean, almost twice the size of the original mansion itself. It sounds totally absurd.
It sounds like a bad joke on
It
it.
really does. But what if I told you that proposals exactly like this are not only real, but they are fundamentally rewriting the psychological landscape of the nation's capital?
Hmm.
Have you ever actually considered how the layout of a city, its sweeping roads, its towering arches, even just the empty green spaces between buildings, isn't just a collection of concrete and grass?
Right, it's so much more than that.
Yeah. What if the physical space around you is actually a three-dimensional manifestation of a society's deeply held values?
It is a profound lens to look through, really. We
Hmm.
tend to think of urban planning as, purely functional, just a way to move traffic or house people, maybe host events.
Just getting from point A to point B.
Exactly. But the truth is, architecture is an argument made in stone.
Hmm.
It tells us who has power, what a culture prioritizes, and honestly, how it views its own history.
And that tension, that exact argument, is the pulsing heart of our deep dive today. We are looking at a highly critical, deeply impassioned opinion piece that was originally published on Patreon.
Yeah, and the title alone is a shot across the bow.
Oh, absolutely. It's titled, "Trump is the Biggest Threat to DC's Architectural Splendor Since War of 1812.
Which is a sweeping, incredibly provocative claim. And the author, they really do not hold back in their analysis of these proposed changes to Washington, D.C.
Now, before we get into the weeds here, I need to make something absolutely crystal clear to you, the listener. Today's source material contains highly politically charged content.
Very much so.
It expresses very strong opinions regarding Donald Trump. And we are not taking sides here. We are not endorsing the viewpoints of the author, nor are we criticizing them.
Right. Our personal politics aren't the point today.
Exactly. The sole mission of this deep dive is to impartially report, unpack, and just explore the architectural history, the philosophical arguments, and the symbolic interpretations that are laid out in this specific original text.
That is exactly right. We are treating the author's text as a framework, a way to explore some deeply interesting questions about urban design, history, and aesthetics.
Mm-hmm.
Our goal is really just to synthesize the arguments presented so you can understand the historical context the author is operating within and, well, decide for yourself what it all means.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the author starts this sweeping critique not with some grand monument or a towering skyscraper.
No, they start with something much smaller.
Yeah, something you might not even notice unless you were looking down from an airplane. They start with the driveway.
Yes, a very specific, loosely circular driveway sweeping through the White House grounds, right below the South Portico.
Right.
It is a modest roadway, sure, but its shape intentionally echoes the ellipse. That massive park connecting the White House to the National Mall. And it directly mirrors the pathways of Lafayette Square to the north.
So this simple symmetry is not an accident at all.
Not even a little bit.
It was the vision of Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., who was this legendary landscape architect. I mean, he was an original member of the Senate Park Commission.
Over a century ago.
Right. And he helped create the monumental core of Washington, D.C. as we know it today. But the source points out that this geometric driveway, this foundational piece of the grounds, is about to be just erased.
Yeah, a federal judge has actually allowed construction to proceed, at least temporarily, on a massive new project at the White House.
Which is wild.
It is. And to make room for this, a large notch is basically going to be clawed right out of Olmsted's carefully designed driveway. The erasure of this subtle curve is really the physical catalyst for the author's entire argument.
Because what is replacing it is staggering in its scale. We are talking about that 90,000 square foot ballroom I mentioned at the top of the show.
It's just massive.
Just to really visualize this for a second, the original White House mansion is only 55,000 square feet.
So this new addition is nearly double the size of the historic house.
Exactly. And to build it, they are literally demolishing the East Wing, which dates all the way back to Franklin D. Roosevelt's administration.
And this is all being overseen by a D.C.-based architecture firm called Shalom Brains Associates, according to the text.
Right. And it's like, imagine taking a meticulously tailored historic piece of clothing, say, a perfectly proportioned 19th century suit.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
and just aggressively sewing a massive neon pocket right onto the front of it.
Oh, wow.
Right. It doesn't just add a pocket. It fundamentally destroys the intended proportions and the aesthetic harmony of the entire garment. Your eye just doesn't know where to look anymore.
That is a perfect way to visualize the critique. Because what's fascinating here is how the author connects this specific micro-level physical change to a much broader historical and philosophical shift.
How so?
Well, early DC design relied heavily on Enlightenment values. The founders and those early architects valued symmetry, iterative patterns, and a very delicate balance between grandeur and grandiosity.
It's a fine line.
A very fine line. And that elliptical drive is a prime example of a composed geometry built up from significant, subtle details.
So replacing a historic, carefully scaled design with a colossal event space turns the neoclassical executive mansion into, what, a mere appendage of its own edition?
Basically, yes. It shifts the building from a dignified residence and office into something meant to function more like a hotel or a convention center or just a high-volume entertainment venue.
Wow. So we have this massive ballroom destroying Olmsted's geometry. But why does the author view this specific stylistic shift as an actual affront to core American ideals?
To understand that, the text reaches way back to 1806, to a letter written by Benjamin Latrobe.
Oh, Latrobe. He is often considered America's first great architect, right?
He is. He worked heavily on the U.S. Capitol and the interiors of the White House. He was a proud, fiercely intellectual, and sometimes difficult man.
As geniuses often are.
Exactly. And he wrote a rather prickly letter to Congress, defending his work. In that defense, he laid out a foundational philosophy for the aesthetics of a newly born republic.
Yeah, he argued that American buildings should be chaste and simple. He literally wrote that a graceful and refined simplicity is the highest achievement of taste and art.
Which is a beautiful way to put it.
It really is. He believed that adding ornamentation just for surface attraction was an absolute folly. His exact thought was that when art declines or ignorance abounds, ornaments increase.
Right.
But I have to ask, does chaste and simple just mean boring? Are we just talking about giant, gray, featureless government blocks?
Not at all. In this context, chaste meant intellectual rigor. Latrobe believed that a building's beauty should come from its perfect proportions, its structural honesty, and its harmony with its surroundings. Let the geometry do the talking.
Oh, I see.
You don't need to bedazzle a beautifully designed structure. Heavy ornamentation, in his view, was usually a trick, a way to hide poor design or to distract the viewer from a lack of true substance.
Ah, so it's the architectural equivalent of speaking softly because your argument is so strong you don't need to shout.
Exactly. And that architectural philosophy was deeply intertwined with the broader intellectual currents of the time. The author brings in Adam Smith to illustrate this.
Adam Smith, the Scottish philosopher.
The very same, best known today as the father of capitalism.
Right.
But in his 1759 work, Theory of Moral Sentiments, Smith contrasted two competing aesthetics that were emerging as the old feudal order broke down.
Okay, so one aesthetic is based on equity, justice, and humility. Smith says it appeals to the studious and careful observer. And the other is based on greed, power, and avidity. He describes it as gaudy, glittering, and forcing itself upon the wandering eye.
It's a stark contrast.
It really is. But why did Smith tie gaudy architecture specifically to greed and feudal power? Like, what is the mechanism there?
It comes down to the psychology of dominance.
Okay.
In a feudal system, a monarch or a lord needs to project unquestionable power over the masses. And you do that by overwhelming the senses.
Well, so giant castles, gold everywhere.
Exactly. You build palaces dripping in gold, towering spires, and glittering facades that literally force the peasant's eye upward in awe and submission.
Wow.
It is architecture designed to make the individual feel small.
Which is the opposite of a democracy.
Right. In contrast, a republic based on equity and democratic participation requires architecture that respects the individual. Spaces that are harmonious, balanced, and invite studious observation rather than demanding blind awe.
And the author uses Adam Smith's framework to categorize the proposed architectural changes in D.C. today.
They do.
They argue that Olmsted's elliptical drive, that mathematical pattern hidden in plain sight, appeals to that studious, careful observer. But in contrast, they view the new aesthetic being proposed as gaudy and glittering. It's an assertion of power and superlative scale that forces itself upon the wandering eye.
And the text lists several examples of this shift. The author mentions a redesign of the Oval Office that introduced historically anachronistic gold ornaments.
Okay.
They point to the hanging of banners featuring gigantic portraits. There was even a proposed, though temporarily delayed, plan to paint the stone facade of the Eisenhower Executive Office, building a blinding shade of white.
A blinding white.
Yeah. The author claims this new aesthetic completely abhors empty space, demanding that every void be filled with noise, branding, and superlatives.
But wait, I have to push back here for a second.
Go ahead.
Isn't architectural evolution perfectly normal for a living city? I mean, look at the Louvre in Paris. They dropped a giant, hyper-modern glass pyramid right in the middle of a historic 12th century courtyard. And it's beloved today. Cities change. They layer new styles over old ones. Why is the author treating these new buildings like they are the biggest threat since the British literally set fire to the Capitol in 1812?
It is a vital counter-argument, but the author's answer rests on the concept of context and conversation.
Context and conversation.
Yes. In a functional, evolving city, architects usually operate within what the author calls gentlemen's agreements.
Which means what, exactly?
It's a voluntary deference to precedents, conventions, and the formal relationships between buildings.
So if we look at the Louvre...
Exactly. If we look at the Louvre, the glass pyramid was a radical intervention, yes. But its geometry was meticulously calculated to reflect the angles of the historic buildings around it.
Oh, that makes sense.
Its transparency was chosen specifically so it wouldn't block the facades of the palace. It was a radical statement, but it was engaging in a respectful conversation with history.
Not a monologue shouting over it.
Precisely. The author argues that the current proposals show a complete lack of deference to historical context or those gentlemen's agreements.
Right.
It is an approach that equates sheer size with significance. It ignores the established hierarchies of how buildings and institutions in D.C. are supposed to relate to one another, and more importantly, it ignores the formal master plans that have guided the city for centuries.
And here's where it gets really interesting, because if you mess with the proportions of the White House, you're actually pulling a thread that unravels the entire fabric of the city.
Yes.
The author zooms out to look at the broader, meticulously planned grid of the Capitol. They argue that this gaudy aesthetic actually threatens the psychological landscape of the nation, specifically through the disruption of something called the Macmillan Plan.
The Macmillan Plan of 1902 was a monumental redesign by the Senate Park Commission. It effectively created the National Mall as we know it today.
Right.
But it wasn't just about planting some elm trees and paving walkways. It was a deeply symbolic axial vision of national healing and reconciliation after the brutal trauma of the Civil War.
Can you define axial vision for us? Like, how does that actually work in practice?
When urban planners talk about an axial vision, they mean drawing an invisible, perfectly straight line through a city that forces your eyes and your footsteps toward a specific monument or idea.
Oh, wow.
The Macmillan Plan engineered very specific, powerful sightlines to visually and physically reconnect the fractured North and South.
So if you, listening right now, have ever stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, you've actually felt this psychology at work.
Absolutely.
You are standing at a monument honoring the political architect of national reunification. And from there, you have a clear, miles-long vista looking straight down the mall to the U.S. Capitol, where a memorial honors Ulysses S. Grant, the military architect of that victory.
And importantly, there is a physical connection extending the other way, across the Potomac River. The Arlington Memorial Bridge leads from the Lincoln Memorial directly to Arlington National Cemetery. It connects a city of the living to a city of the dead, joining the north to the low-lying hills of Virginia.
It gives me chills just thinking about it.
The designers of the Macmillan Plan were absolute fanatics about preserving the dignity and sobriety of this specific sightline.
They actually rejected early bridge designs that included massive arches, didn't they?
They did. They stripped away a plan for 40 decorative sculptures. They wanted the bridge to be low-slung, simple, and elegant.
Because they understood the physical sensation of reverence. They believed that as you approached the hallowed burial grounds of Civil War soldiers, the architecture needed to become quieter, more chaste.
Exactly.
A low bridge physically lowers your gaze. It prepares you psychologically for a space of mourning and reflection.
Which makes the new proposals the author outlines seem incredibly jarring.
Yeah, let's talk about those.
The author details a proposal for a 250-foot Independence Arch to be built in a traffic circle on the Virginia side of the Potomac, right near Arlington.
250 feet. To put that in perspective, the famous Washington Square Park Arch in New York is only 77 feet tall.
Right.
This new arch would dwarf the Victory Arch in Pyongyang, North Korea. In fact, the only arch in the entire world that would be taller is the Gateway Arch in St. Louis.
It would fundamentally alter the D.C. skyline. It would instantly compete with the Washington Monument and the National Cathedral for visual dominance.
Wow.
And according to the source, the designs that have been shared on social media show this massive structure laden with gilded statues and golden eagles. It would completely block that carefully preserved, solemn view across the Arlington Memorial Bridge.
It's like someone standing up in the front row of a beautiful, historic movie theater. It doesn't matter how gorgeous the theater itself is if someone deliberately puts a massive gilded obstruction right in front of the screen.
That's a great analogy.
Your experience of the space is totally ruined, and it doesn't stop there. The author mentions a proposed National Garden of American Heroes that would sit on the Potomac banks opposite this new arch.
Yes.
It's described as cluttering a sylvan space, a space currently defined by the monumental, deeply spaced-out memorials to Roosevelt, Martin Luther King Jr., and Jefferson, with a wax museum-style forest of hundreds of statues.
Honoring everyone from showbiz stars to folk heroes.
Right.
If we look closely at the author's symbolic interpretation of all this, it paints a very stark picture of what is being communicated to the public.
Let's hear it.
Let's start back at the White House ballroom. The author argues that its massive 90,000 square foot scale actually reorients the executive mansion.
Reorients it how?
Instead of maintaining its standalone symmetry, the addition makes the White House look like it is physically mating with a massive Treasury Department building right next door.
Oh, wow.
Symbolically, the author says this visually suggests the executive branch now serves the financial class first and foremost. It trades domestic, Republican livability for the sheer power of a banking colossus.
That is a heavy interpretation. What about the arch?
The author's interpretation of the triumphal arch is equally pointed and deeply tied to American history.
Okay.
By placing a massive gilded Victory Arch on the Virginia side of the river, towering over the landscape, the author argues it effectively and visually crowns the South as the ultimate victor of the Civil War.
That's a bold claim.
They write that the heavy gilding of the arch directly echoes the tinsel applied to American history through entrenched mythologies like the Lost Cause.
And for anyone who might need a refresher, the Lost Cause is that historical revisionism that attempts to romanticize the Confederacy, downplay the horrors of slavery, and reframe the Civil War as a noble, heroic defense of states' rights rather than a rebellion.
Yes.
The author is suggesting that this arch physically manifests that revisionist mythology in gold and stone.
Exactly. It uses overpowering scale to rewrite the careful healing narrative that the Macmillan Plan tried to establish a century ago.
So if these historic plans, these sightlines, and these gentlemen's agreements are so deeply embedded in the identity of the capital, well, how are these massive new proposals getting approved?
That is the big question.
We've talked about the what and the why, but how is this practically happening?
That brings us to the administrative reality of urban planning, specifically a body called the Commission of Fine Arts.
Okay.
This commission was created in 1910 explicitly to oversee the design of the city and to protect the long-term vision of the Macmillan Plan. They are the gatekeepers of DC's aesthetics.
But the author claims that this critical oversight group has been effectively dismantled or just entirely bypassed.
Yep.
The text notes that the commission has been stacked with loyalists who lack serious architectural or historical expertise. As a glaring example, the author highlights that one of the members appointed to judge the architectural integrity of the nation's capital is a 26-year-old former executive assistant to the president.
It's quite a shift. The author points to this staffing change, along with the collaboration of architecture firms who are perfectly willing to take on these lucrative projects, as evidence that the entire centuries-old process of design review has been upended.
And then there is the question of funding, which introduces just another layer of opacity to the whole situation.
Right, the money.
That $400 million ballroom at the White House is reportedly being financed privately. The author points out that this money is coming from corporate contractors and billionaires who hold massive federal contracts.
Which raises obvious questions.
Yeah. Meanwhile, they suggest the sprawling statue garden might siphon money directly away from the National Endowments for the Arts and Humanities. The final price tag for the taxpayer and the potential conflicts of interest for the private donors remain completely unknown.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, The author is really sounding a frantic alarm about the structural integrity of civic planning in America.
What's their ultimate conclusion?
It's incredibly bleak. They say design review in Washington, D.C., as it has been understood for over a century, is dead.
Dead. Wow.
The capital is no longer being shaped by the careful consensus of the Macmillan Plan or the Enlightenment philosophies of Latrobe and Smith. Instead, the author argues, the city is now subject to design by fiat, by whim, and by executive orders.
So what does this all mean for you and me? The author makes a really poignant observation toward the very end of the piece.
I thought so too.
They point out that everyday people, tourists walking down Pennsylvania Avenue or families visiting from out of town, they might not know the intricate history of the Commission of Fine Arts.
Probably not.
They probably haven't read Adam Smith's philosophical debates from 1759, but they will inherently sense the change.
Yes, they will feel it.
They will physically feel the disorder and incoherence of these massive, glittering structures clashing with the quiet dignity of the older buildings. And ultimately, overwhelmed by the sheer scale, they will tune it out as just more noise.
It is a profound point about how architecture operates on a subconscious level. When public spaces are designed with care, with open vistas, proportionate scale, and a respect for the individual's line of sight, people feel a sense of civic dignity.
They feel like they belong there.
Exactly. But when spaces are treated as empty voids just waiting to be filled with branding, gold plating, and sheer superlative scale, the psychological experience of the city degrades.
It makes the citizen feel small.
Which is exactly what Adam Smith warned against.
We've covered an immense amount of ground today. We started with the seemingly minor erasure of Frederick Law Olmsted's driveway, a small, mathematically perfect detail on the White House grounds.
Yes, we did.
We explored how early architects like Benjamin Latrobe and philosophers like Adam Smith argued for chaste and simple designs, believing that heavy ornamentation was a gaudy display of feudal power.
And we traced how those Enlightenment values were institutionalized in the 1902 Macmillan Plan. Engineering powerful sightlines meant to heal a fractured nation after the Civil War.
Right.
Sightlines that the author argues are now critically threatened by colossal 250-foot arches and sprawling statue gardens that prioritize superlative size over historical context.
Again, we've simply unpacked the source author's perspective on these sweeping changes today. We aren't telling you what to think of the arch or the ballroom, but this text serves as an incredible reminder for all of us.
It really does.
Whether you are walking past the White House in Washington, D.C., or just walking down the main street of your own hometown, the buildings towering over you are not accidental.
No, they are arguments in stone.
They tell a story about who holds power in that exact moment and what that society truly values.
Architecture is the most public, unavoidable of all arts. We cannot opt out of experiencing the cities we build.
Which leaves us with a lingering thought to chew on. We talked at the very beginning about how a city's layout is a physical manifestation of a society's values. If every era of leadership leaves a permanent architectural fingerprint on its capital city, how might the physical spaces we are rushing to build today be interpreted by historians 200 years from now? Are we laying the foundations for monuments that reflect shared, enduring civic ideals? Or are we just pouring the fleeting, chaotic noise of our current news cycle directly into concrete?